Hello everyone, in this video we will be going over how to create a customized Elemental plugin. So we're going to create our own module, and you might want to commit this to a Git repository. So we're going to go to our terminal, we're going to say cd vendor. Now this is not tracked by our site's Git repository, so if you're using Git, just be aware of that. So we're going to make a directory for our vendor, and you'll likely want to call this whatever your GitHub username is. So I'll just say Tyler for now. So make directory Tyler, we'll cd into that, and then we're going to make the directory for our module. So we're going to say mkdir, and we're going to call it Elemental extension. Or I guess you could call that whatever you like. But for the sake of this video, just remember the name that you use for this, because we're going to use the same name in Composer. So here you will likely want to run a git init, so that way you can track this, push it up to GitHub, and then add this as a dependency to your site within your site's Composer file. So it would be in here, and then you would define a repositories section here with a link to your GitHub repository. Next we will run a composer init, and then this will probably default to your user and then the name of the extension. So I'm gonna just override this to Tyler Elemental extension, and then just go ahead and hit enter. You can add a description if you like, but for the rest of these you could just keep pressing enter until the composer.json is generated. Now you can say subl.composer.json. Now in our requirement statement, we're going to have a dependency for the Elemental module. So we're going to say DNA design SilverStripe Elemental, and we're going to set that to _4. Now we are going to need an _config.php file in the same directory. That way SilverStripe can pick up our module. So we're just going to say Control-N next to the composer.json so that it can already save in the correct directory. And we're going to just put a PHP tag here, and you might want a namespace here, but that's up to you. Just know that if you use that, you can use any namespaced classes that you define as long as they're under the same namespace in this module, but you will need to explicitly use any global ones like use page, like that. So we're gonna put a namespace in here. We're gonna say namespace Tyler, and then the name of the module. So it's kind of like the same convention. Then we need to save that as _config.php. Now we are going to make a directory for our source code. So we're going to say mkdir src, and we'll just arrow up, and we're going to create our new element now. So we're going to create a grid element.php. We're going to hit the home key, delete a few, and then say subl source grid element.php, and that's going to open up a new file. We are going to add the same namespace that we used in our config file, and we are going to import these classes here, and we are going to say class grid element extends base element. Now because this is namespaced, we will want to define a table name property, so we'll say private static table _name, and it will just be the name of the class. So grab grid element here and paste it there. Next we will want these properties here. They're a little redundant, so I just went ahead and pasted them in, but go ahead and add a singular name, plural name, and description. So the element that we're creating here is going to be an element that manages grid section objects that have content. That way they can all display in a grid fashion, and each of them can have different widths. So you might have two 50% sections. One might be a image, one might be some text, and they display next to each other. And then in a mobile view, would be responsive and they would go to full width and take up the entire phone device width. So what we're going to do is define that relationship. So we're going to say private static has many, and this should look familiar here. Then we're going to define that. So grid sections, going to point that to the grid section class that we will be creating here. Okay, so I went ahead and started this class already. So go ahead and get the PHP tags, the namespace, all of these classes here. Define the class, it extends data object, and add this table name property because we're using a namespace class. So we're going to add the database properties here. And this is going to have a title, and that's going to be text. And then we're going to have content, which is the HTML text. And then we're going to have desktop width, and this is an integer. And then we're going to have phone width. And you might even have like a tablet width, but for now we're just going to do desktop and phone. Now you might have already guessed that we need to relate this back to the grid element because we defined a has many here. So this needs to have a corresponding has one. So we're going to say private static has one, and this is going to be grid element, and the same thing, we're going to point that to the grid element class. And we don't need to import that because we're using it under the same namespace. Actually, that should be Tyler Elemental extension. Now we will define the CMS fields for this. So it's public function get CMS fields. And we will return a new field list. And we will use mostly text fields. So text field create title. Actually, we're going to use a HTML editor for the HTML text. So we're going to add the two width fields in here. And then we'll say HTML, or actually no, this is under content. But the CMS field will be an HTML editor field. So we'll replace this here. Yeah, just like that. And then we're going to add one more property here. It's going to be summary fields. And this is what gets used in the grid field to label this. Otherwise, it would just use the ID, which wouldn't really be helpful. So we're going to set this to the title. Just a minor correction here. Go ahead and put the desktop width and phone width before the content, and then make sure you don't have a trailing comma here. That would work in an array. Like we could have a comma here, and you probably should. It's kind of best practice. But you can't have that in a field list like this because this isn't actually an array. It's just a non-limited amount of arguments. Now we are going to actually install the SilverStripe Elemental package. Now if you were installing your module with Composer, like I mentioned before, you wouldn't have to do this because it's a dependency. But for the sake of this video, go ahead and drop the SilverStripe Elemental package as a requirement on your site and run Composer update. Now the grid field that this would add won't actually work in the inline editable form. So we're going to just add this inline editable property here just for the sake of this video. We will fix this later on, but for now we're going to set this to false. And what this will do will make this section of this grid element type clickable, and it will take us to a different edit form within the CMS. Now I also want the desktop width and the phone width on the element itself, so we're just going to go ahead and copy this whole array here. We'll paste it here, and we can just remove the content and title fields. Now we're going to need a template for our grid element, but because this is namespaced, it would require that our templates directory also be namespaced, and I don't really want to do that. So what we're going to do is override this get render templates method here. So we're just going to copy all of this, paste this in here, and then right here we will copy this down, but what we will do is we'll say this class name equals grid element. And that should allow us to use just a basic template in a templates directory. Now we can go ahead and make that templates directory. So we will say mkdir templates, and then we will say grid element.ss in that templates directory. So we will open up a new div. We will give it the class grid element desktop width, and we will set that to the desktop width. And we will do the same thing for the phone width. So we will say phone width and phone width. And then we will say if grid sections, then we will loop over the grid section. So we will say loop grid sections Then inside of this, we will put a new div called grid element. Oh, excuse me, this should be grid. Same thing here. We will call this grid section container, and we will do the same phone width and desktop width classes here. Okay. And then inside of this, we will put a little bit of spacing. So we will say div class grid section space. And then we will put the grid section's content inside of this. Next, we will need to add the Sass so that these styles here will work. So in order to do that, we're going to need to include webpack. And to do that, we need to initialize npm within our project. So we'll go over to our terminal and we'll type in npm init. And same thing here, you can basically just hit enter throughout this. Now this will generate a package.json file in our module. Now we will download an older version of webpack. That way this works with the SilverStripe webpack config. So you will run npm I webpack at 2.7 and then say save dev here to install this as a dev dependency. Next, we are going to install the SilverStripe webpack config, but before we do that, since we're going to be installing node modules, and if we were going to commit this to a Git repository, which we likely would, we need a git ignore to ignore the node modules folder. So what we'll do is say vi.git ignore, and then we'll just type in node modules in here. And if you've used Vim before, you need to use the I key to start typing in insert mode. And then you would hit escape, and then you would say :WQ for write quit. Then you would install this with npm I at SilverStripe webpack config. Now, if you get an npm error when installing this, just go ahead and manually type this in as a regular dependency. Really, this should be a dev dependency, but for some reason, this is the only way I could get this to load. So just type this in at this 1.7 release and run an npm install. Now we're going to create our webpack config file. You can mostly just copy this here from the repository's README. So we're going to go ahead and do that. We're going to copy this, going to open up a new file, and then save that as webpackconfig.js. Now we'll just comment the JavaScript section out for now. We will come back to this whenever we add some custom React injection to the CMS, but for now we're just concerned with getting our SCSS compiled. Now we will add a dist directory, so we will change this to dist and this to dist here. That way, whenever we run our compiler, the source code gets compiled and then sent to this dist directory. So then we'll go down here and we'll change this to site because we will actually add some custom CMS styling later on. Then we will change these two backticks here because we are going to be using some ES6 string templating. So we'll say paths dot source, and then this will be SCSS, and then we can remove this here. So we'll look for the source directory here, and then it will look in the CSS subfolder for the site SCSS. And then the output would be just paths dot dist. And lastly, we will output CSS compilations under a styles directory. Now what this is going to do is whenever we run webpack, it is going to look for a site.scss under client source SCSS, and then it's going to output it to the client dist styles, and then this is a variable here for whatever our entry point is. And whenever we add a CMS, it would look something like this, and then have a different path here looking for the CMS styling, and then that would just go under the same directory but use a different name. Now back in our modules package.json, we need to add those scripts. So we will say build, and this will be just webpack, and then we will have the watch for watching changes. We did this before on the site, but now we're going to do the same thing for our module. And we're going to go ahead and throw a progress here too. Now we'll go ahead and create those styles. So we're going to need the directory. So we're going to say mkdir client. Then we'll say client source SCSS, and then the file. So this is going to be site.scss, and we will say subbul to open up a new file. And we'll reveal this in the sidebar to see that it has the correct directory structure. Now we'll start styling. So we're going to say grid element display flex. You could do display grid here, but flex is a little bit simpler for the sake of this video. So we're going to say flex wrap. That way elements will wrap whenever they go to a phone width at 100% width. So have a grid section in here, grid section container, and then a grid section space. And we'll just give this 20 pixels of padding. And then we'll do a Sass loop for all of our percentage width fields. So this beats writing a class for every single potential width 0 through 100. We're going to loop from 0 to 100 for each potential device width that we can set in our grid sections. So we'll say for I from 0 through 100, we will say desktop width. Then we will put our I variable in here with the pound and squiggly brackets. So it will be I with a $sign as well. And then for the actual style rule itself, we need to multiply by 1%. So it's going to look like this. Now we'll do the same thing for the phone width, but we need to throw it under a media query. So we'll say media max width 815 pixels, and then just copy this down here, fix the indentation, and change this to phone. Then when we run npm run build, it should generate the dist and styles directory as well as the generated CSS file. Now back in our underscore config.php file, we will use this requirements class here. So we will add a CSS for this, and then we will use our modules. So for me, it'll be Tyler Elemental extension, and then colon, and then the path to our CSS here. So it will be client dist styles and site.css. Now we will need to expose those front-end assets in our composer file. So we will say extra, then we will open up some squiggly brackets. We will say expose, and this takes an array, and we will say client dist. Now we will need to configure our module to work on our site. So we will go into the app config, and we can just go into my site YAML, and we will add an extension for our page. So we'll say page extensions, and then dash DNA design elemental extensions elemental page extension. Now in our page.php file, we will add these classes here, and then we will override the CMS fields. So we'll say public function get CMS fields, and then we will get the fields from the parent. So we'll say fields equals parent get CMS fields, and then we will get the elemental area that would be added by default. So we'll say elemental area equals fields field by name root main elemental area. Now we are going to remove this one because we are going to add it in a new tab set. So we'll say fields remove by name elemental area, and then this one needs to be capitalized. And then we will start our new tabs. Down here we'll say insert after new tab set, and then we'll call this page content new tab HTML content, and this is for our standard content. And then we'll insert an HTML editor field in here. Now the elemental module would normally remove this. That's why we need to insert it back in into a tab set like this. Then we will add another tab for elemental. So we'll say new tab again, and then this will be elemental. We can just remove that area there. And then we will put our variable in here. And then we need to insert after navigation label and put a semicolon down here. Lastly, we will just return the fields. Now we will want this to be rendered in our React component, so we need to feed this in our page controller. So just below the content, we'll go ahead and copy this down, but instead we'll say elemental area, and then this would be for template, and then raw. Excuse me, that should be elemental area. Then back in our page component, we will want to make sure that we are running webpack, so we'll say npm run watch on our site directory here. Make sure that you're not doing this within the module. And then down here, we will copy down the content, and we will get the elemental area. So we'll say elemental area, and then data dot elemental area. And then we will insert this the same way we do the content. So we'll just copy this down here and then grab this and copy that there. Looks like we have a syntax error here in our page file. So this is not in the class, so we need to move that squiggly bracket down here and fix that indentation. And one last thing for our module here, back in our grid element, go ahead and add this getType method here and return a grid element string. This is kind of like a summary field for our grid element. Otherwise it would just say block, and that's not really helpful or descriptive of what this kind of content is. Alright, and then run the dev build on your site, and after that you should see that we have our HTML content in a tab here, and then we have elemental over here. I went ahead and added a test element, but you can add a block, and then you can see the standard base content. This is basically just an HTML editor field, and then you can see the grid element that we created. So if we go inside of that, you can see that we have the desktop width and the phone width fields that we added, and then we have this grid field for our grid sections. So we have our text and an image. Each of them is set to 50% width. But if we go to our front end, we can see that we have our width classes here. Like if we inspect this here, we could see that this has 50% width on desktop and 100% width on phone, but we don't have any of the styling, and that's because we need to expose our client dist folder. So we can go ahead and cancel webpack here and run composer vendor -expose. Okay, so you may need to hold shift and press refresh, but you can see here that now our section is 50% width, our text over here, and our image here. It looks a little bit ugly now, but that's just because we have the actual grid element set to 50% width here. So we could just override that, set that to 100. That way it's always full width. And then now this looks a little bit better because we can take up the entire width here. And then whenever we shrink down to a phone width, each of these takes 100% width, although we could do something about this image so that it's not getting cut off like that. That's about it for this video though. This is kind of run a little bit longer, but in the next video we're going to try to update the blog a little bit. We still haven't adjusted the articles and put those in the tab. Yeah, we could add an articles tab and move these down here. And also we will be getting into React injection and create a custom width slider field. So I'll catch you then.